All right, let's get right into it. We are officially 90 days into the recent escalation of the US-Iran conflict. And if you've been scrolling through the news lately, you know there's just a massive whirlwind of conflicting information out there. It's honestly hard to keep track. So today, in this explainer, we're taking a step back. We're cutting out the noise, dropping the spin, and strictly looking at the data to see what is actually happening on the ground after 3 solid months of fighting. Let's dive in.
Now, you've probably seen headlines screaming something exactly like this. An agreement has been largely negotiated. U.S. media outlets and even social media posts directly from American leadership have been constantly claiming that a victory deal is practically done. But here's where it gets interesting, because the source material shows a completely different reality. While Washington keeps forecasting immediate ceasefires and finalized agreements, Tehran is consistently coming out and saying, no, absolutely not, there is no final deal. That massive disconnect between what's being said in the US and the actual reality in Iran, that is exactly why we need to dig into this.
So that brings us to the million-dollar question, right? Is a permanent peace deal actually happening? To figure that out, we have to ignore the breaking news banners and the daily tweets. We really need to look at the actual documents being passed around behind closed doors and the hard, factual outcomes on the battlefield over these last 90 days. Here is exactly how we're going to break this all down today. First, we'll look at the peace deal illusion. Second, we're going inside the draft MOU. Third, we'll grade the 90-day report card. And finally, we'll zoom out to look at the shifting global power dynamics. All right, part one, the peace deal illusion. Let's take a hard look at the actual document currently in play. Okay, so the absolutely crucial thing you have to understand here is that the document currently on the table, it is not a peace treaty, not even close. It's a draft 60-day Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. That's it. It is strictly a temporary framework meant to extend a ceasefire and essentially buy a 60-day window for more negotiations, mostly about nuclear steps and regional shipping. Period. It's just a pause button, not a permanent fix. Moving on to Section 2. Inside that draft MOU, let's look at what's actually in these proposed terms. What is truly fascinating here is the stark contrast between what made it into the draft and what was completely left out. Leaked reports show the current draft includes that 60-day ceasefire, talks about unfreezing $12 billion in Iranian assets, and get this, a proposal for a $300 billion U.S. investment in Iran. The sources actually note this is being offered in place of direct war reparations. But look at what is totally missing. There's literally zero mention of dismantling Iran's ballistic missile program, no framework for controlling their proxy networks, and no permanent commitments on their nuclear program. I mean, these were the major focal points when this whole conflict started, and they're just not there. And all of this reveals the ridiculously complex diplomatic chessboard being played behind the scenes right now. It's not just the US and Iran in a room. We are talking about Pakistan's army chief and Qatari delegations holding super quiet meetings in Tehran. At the exact same time, over in Washington, Vice President J.D. Vance is scrambling through emergency meetings with top negotiators. And to top it all off, the U.S. has reportedly been pushing Gulf nations on private conference calls, trying to get them to sign the Abraham Accords in exchange for accepting this deal. It is a massive, multi-nation scramble to find an exit strategy. Which brings us to Section 3, the 90-day report card. Let's see how those original war goals actually held up. Think back to the start of this conflict on February 28th. The U.S. very publicly outlined 5 specific, stated war goals. Well, 90 days later, we are going to objectively grade the factual outcomes of those 5 goals. Let's see the results. Goal number 1 was regime change, specifically eliminating the threats from the existing regime's leaders. So what's the reality? Well, it's a fact that over 40 top leaders were killed in those initial days, but the regime definitely didn't fall. Instead, on March 8th, Mujtaba Khamenei was appointed, and reports actually indicate that the hardline Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has only strengthened its political grip internally. All right, goal number 2, annihilate Iran's missile and naval capabilities. But when you look at the internal U.S. intelligence cited in the reports, it turns out only about a third of Iran's total missile arsenal was actually degraded or used. The vast majority of it is still fully operational or hidden away in tunnels. And here's the wild part. Iran's naval Mosquito Brigade actually managed to keep the crucial Strait of Hormuz completely closed off for months, successfully fighting off U.S. operational efforts to pry it back open. And that leads us right to this staggering number. 400 kilograms. That is the exact amount of highly enriched uranium Iran currently has sitting in its possession. This directly ties into goals 3 and 4, which were all about excavating that uranium and guaranteeing no nuclear weapons could be developed. Now, early on, there was a lot of talk that the US was going to physically go in, excavate, and remove this material. But the reality of this new draft MOU is completely different. The current proposal asks Iran to dilute its enriched uranium down to 3.67%. Now, if that number sounds familiar, it's because 3.67% is the exact same dilution level that was mandated by the Obama-era nuclear deal. You know, the very same deal the U.S. famously tore up back in 2018. The irony there is pretty hard to miss.
And finally, goal number 5, forcing the Strait of Hormuz open for unrestricted, toll-free access. The reality of the negotiation table? Iran is countering with a proposal to set up a permanent Persian Gulf Strait Authority. So instead of giving up control of the strait, Iran is actually trying to institutionalize its control over the waterway, and they're proposing to run it jointly with Oman.
Now, all of this has a very real price tag. The direct financial cost to the U.S. for this 90-day engagement is sitting at an estimated $25 billion. But the reason this matters to you and me is the ripple effect across the globe. We're seeing currency values drop, like the Indian rupee taking a hit, and global fuel prices are fluctuating wildly, which of course eventually trickles down right to our everyday wallets. All right, let's wrap up with Section 4, the global power dynamics shift. Let's look at how this is changing the wider world. The sources make it incredibly clear that this 90-day conflict has acted like a giant catalyst for shifting international alliances. What used to be this kind of cautious, arm's-length coordination between Russia, China, and Iran has solidified into a highly structured alignment. I mean, during the fighting, reports showed that China's Beidou satellite network was actively guiding Iranian missiles, while Russian satellites were busy tracking U.S. warships. This new axis effectively used this entire conflict as a testing ground to see how well they could collaborate against U.S. military infrastructure. And honestly, that is the core takeaway of this entire explainer. The global power equation is fundamentally shifting away from unchallenged dominance. Think about it. A heavily sanctioned country, operating on just a tiny fraction of the U.S. defense budget, was able to absorb a massive combined initial strike, punch back at regional bases, and ultimately force a negotiated stalemate. And you better believe Beijing is watching this play out incredibly closely. Analysts are pointing out that China is using the U.S.'s inability to achieve its stated goals in the Middle East as a direct metric to gauge American military limits, which is huge when you consider their future calculations regarding Taiwan. So, as we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've dug through the draft documents, we've graded the original military objectives, and we've mapped out this massive geopolitical realignment. This 90-day reality check paints a picture of a world that looks vastly different than it did just 3 months ago. So, with the dynamics fundamentally changed and negotiations relying so heavily on the threat of force rather than just diplomacy, who really holds the cards now? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the headlines.